Okay, it is now 10:32. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Acterra's virtual lecture, The Role of Agriculture in Climate Change, Livestock, Diets, and Soil Carbon Sequestration. My name is Robbie Brown, and I'm the Community Engagement Associate for Acterra. Before we begin, there's a few things I want to mention. Let's first go over the Zoom logistics. So for the purpose of this event, everyone is muted and your cameras are turned off. However, if you feel like you would like to communicate, we do have the chat box enabled. My intern, Risa Mori, is also helping us out today. So if you have any complications on your end, you can either send her or I a private message and we'll try to help you the best we can. We will have a Q&A portion during this event as well. To submit a question for Pete, what you will want to do is open the Q&A tab in the bottom of the Zoom application and then submit your question. Guests will also be able to upvote. So if there's a particular question that's been asked and you find that one really interesting or compelling and you want to make sure we get to it, please make sure you upvote that. I can't guarantee we'll be able to answer every question, but we'll certainly try our best. Next on the list, who or what is Acterra? If you haven't heard of us, we are an environmental nonprofit based in the Bay Area, and to be more specific, we are located within Palo Alto. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary, which was really exciting. And we are largely driven by environmental problems occurring locally and globally, and primarily the problems that have resulted due to climate change. We engage with our local communities, companies, and agencies in the Bay Area with a focus on Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. We have a wide variety of programming under the categories of electrification, food sustainability, workplace sustainability, and education. For electrification, we have our Carl Knapp Go EV program, so EV as in electric vehicles, and we have an induction cooktop program. For food sustainability, we just kicked off our Healthy Plate, Healthy Planet programming, where we focus on low carbon food choices and solutions for consumers, the commercial industry, and schools and students. For workplace sustainability, we have our Silicon Valley Green Team Network and our Business Environmental Awards. And for our education component, we have our public lecture series, our Youth Be the Change program, and the Climate Resilient Communities. Acterra does not endorse or support the expressed opinions of any of our speakers, but our aim is just merely to present a diverse range of views to help advance these conversations and to allow deeper reflections on challenging issues. All right, next. Let's get to our sponsors. So of course, we would like to thank our sponsors for the support with this event. We have Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, Grounded in Community, Greentown Los Altos, 350 Silicon Valley, and specifically their food and climate team, Silicon Valley North Citizens Climate Lobby, and the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto. Let's talk about our upcoming events for the next 2 months. Our next event that is coming up is with Acterra's Young Professionals, and it is a webinar called Taking Action for Environmental Justice. This is a webinar led by Christy Drutman, the creator of Brown Girl Green. She will be discussing her career pathway as an environmental media creator and activist, as well as provide information about environmental justice and how young people can take action to address environmental inequities in their communities. We also have a virtual coffee hour with Acterra's Executive Director, Lauren Weston. She invites all of you to attend this virtual conversation to learn more about Acterra's programs and future direction. We have a Let's Go EV online workshop. This workshop will cover the benefits of being an electric car owner and reveal the many EV rebate programs and other financial perks that make EVs cheaper to own than gas-powered cars. And we also have a documentary screening and panel discussion coming up in September based on the documentary, The Invisible Vegan. So the panel discussion will be centered around Jasmine C. Leiva's compelling documentary, The Invisible Vegan. Join us for a thought-provoking conversation with filmmaker Jasmine and other guests about food justice, healthy eating, culturally relevant plant-based choices, and the decolonization of food. Last but not least, I wanted to make a quick announcement that we are launching a new interactive online community for those that are interested in sustainable food and plant-forward eating. It's a great place to share recipes, bounce ideas, and get support, as well as find resources. If you are interested, please send us an email at healthyplate@acterra.org and we will put you on the list. Great, so today's lecture is by Professor Pete Smith. He is a professor of soils and global change at the Institute of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of Aberdeen, which is in Scotland. He's also the science director of the Scottish Climate Change Centre of Expertise. His interests include climate change mitigation, soils, agriculture, food system, ecosystem services, and modeling. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, a fellow of the Institute of Soil Scientists, a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, a foreign fellow of the Indian National Science Academy, and a fellow of the European Science Academy, as well as a fellow of the Royal Society of London. Professor Pete Smith, I'm going to hand it off to you now. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Robbie. So I'll start sharing my screen now. Okay, can you all see that? I'm assuming that you can. So today I'm going to be talking about the role of agriculture in climate change with a particular focus on diets, livestock, and soil carbon sequestration. So the first thing to recognize is that the food system is part of the climate problem. So if we look at greenhouse gas emissions for all of the sectors, all of the greenhouse gas emissions globally, agriculture and forestry accounts for about 24% of the direct emissions. So nearly a quarter of the direct emissions is from the agricultural sector. But when we consider the food system more widely, for example, including transport, refrigeration, packaging, and retail, that number climbs to about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. So very little about what you hear about climate change focuses on food and agriculture. We often hear about the need to change energy generation, the need to change the way that we move around in private transport, industry, and the way that we heat and cool our buildings. But a sort of a Cinderella story of the emissions sectors is agriculture, and being responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a really important sector. So it's worth noting that it's part of the problem. But that also makes the fact that it emits about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, it also means that activity in this sector can help to reduce climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So if we look at the way some of the emission categories in agriculture and forestry, I'll just go through some of these in a little detail. So there are things like land use change for forestry, so that's ground clearing, tropical deforestation and such like. The clearing of the land for agriculture is a big source of emissions. The draining of peats and peat fires, enteric fermentation, so that's the methane emissions that are belched out by ruminants, burped out by ruminants when they eat, because of they're generated in the rumen when they digest grass and other foods, and that's quite a significant emission source. There's rice cultivation, which is a methane emission source. There's manure management. Synthetic fertilizers are responsible for large emissions of nitrous oxide, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. There are other forms of manure and crop residues and savanna burning. So adding all these things together, they contribute to quite large emissions, which account for, without all the other emissions from the food system, just the agriculture and forestry direct emissions itself contributes about a quarter of the emissions. So we can reduce emissions by either reducing these emissions categories that I've shown on here, so reducing tropical deforestation, reducing drainage of peats for agriculture, reducing enteric fermentation by cutting the numbers of ruminants, improving rice cultivation, improving manure management and cropland management and such like. All of these things can reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. But there are also other things that we can do on the demand side. So agriculture is only in existence because it produces the food that we need and the food that we demand. So by changing the demands for the food, the types of food that we eat, and also reducing the waste, about 30% of all food that we grow on the planet is wasted in one way or another. If we can reduce waste and we can change our diets towards a more sustainable eating, then there's these demand side mitigation options which need to work in consort with the supply side mitigation. And I'll talk a lot more about those later. So let's move more specifically to the role of livestock in climate change. Livestock feature quite prominently, and there's a reason for that. When we look at ruminant products, so this graph shows the carbon dioxide emissions per kilogram of product. So here we have kilograms of CO2 per kilograms of product. Over on the left of the graph, you can see we have the beef and the sheep, and moving across here, different intensiveness of beef and such like. These are the ruminants. So these are the animals which were evolutionarily bred to digest grass, some of which we still feed grass today, but some of which we're also feeding concentrates, for example, grain-fed beef. But you can see that the emissions, the direct emissions, are many, many times greater than those over on the other side of the graph. So per kilogram of product, we have minuscule emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from the pulses like the beans, the peas, the soy, for the meat substitutes, slightly higher emissions for eggs, poultry and pork. So these are they're called the monogastric animals. So they're not ruminants, they're monogastric animals, and they produce less methane per unit product. But the ruminants over on the left-hand side of the graph are really important sources of methane emissions. So the emissions from these ruminant meat and dairy is between 10 and 100 times worse than plant-based foods. That's not 10% and 100%. That's 10 orders of magnitude, an order of magnitude 10 times worse, or 2 orders of magnitude 100 times worse per unit of product. So if we're consuming lots of products on the left of the graph, we're going to have a much higher greenhouse gas footprint than a diet that contains more of the products on the right of the graph, so more pulses and beans and meat substitutes. So that's where the idea about dietary change to contribute to the climate change problems comes about. And it's due to this really striking 10 to 100 times greater impact per unit product of the meats compared to the plant-based foods. If we break this down a little bit further, so as I've said, around about 25 to 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from food. That's the top part. Taking that 26% of emissions from food, if we break it down into animal products and everything else, animal products are responsible for about 58% of all the greenhouse gas impacts of the foods we eat. So it's a disproportionately large share of the greenhouse gas emissions are from animal products, considering the amount that we consume relative to plant-based foods. And of those animal products, just 2 products, beef and lamb, make up about 50% of that greenhouse gas footprint. So by reducing consumption of beef and lamb, we could make a significant contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's going to be a central message of today's talk. We'll come back to that in a moment. So sometimes people have said grazing livestock, okay, they emit methane, so they contribute to climate change. But when livestock are grazed on grass, they sequester carbon, and that benefits the climate. So what about that claim? Let's look at that claim in a bit more detail. So the claim is that grazing livestock sequester carbon in the soil, and that therefore benefits the climate. So there's a suggestion that eating grass-fed beef will contribute and will be a great solution for the climate. That unfortunately is unsubstantiated. So unless you have severely degraded grasslands, the grasslands already contain large stocks of carbon. So given that they already contain a large stock of carbon, then there's only so much that they can store, that is to say that they saturate, so they've got little capacity to sequester further additional carbon. You can think of it like a bucket of water that's already full up with water. Just tipping more water in the top won't store more water in the bucket, it just spills over the side because it's already full. It's similar with the soils. They can only store so much carbon, and when more carbon is added, that carbon is just lost from the system through oxidation and respiration. Secondly, there's little evidence that changing grazing patterns can increase soil carbon levels. So there are many claims made currently with little scientific basis that if we change the way the animals graze, we move them around and graze them intensively on small portions of the grassland for short periods of time, this will greatly increase the soil carbon levels. Currently, there's very little evidence that that actually happens, and quite a lot of evidence that it has a negligible impact. Another thing to consider is that the methane emissions from cattle far outweigh any of the benefits that we get from soil carbon. So even if we got a degraded pasture and we improve the soil carbon in that degraded pasture, we still have the emissions from the livestock, the methane emissions. And when we look at the climate warming potential of those methane emissions, they outweigh any of the benefits that we get from the stored soil carbon. And the other thing is that soil carbon gains are time limited. That's because they saturate, but methane emissions continue for a long period after the carbon's saturated. So if you've got a field of cows that you keep for say 100 years, even if you can increase the soil carbon a little, after 10 years or 20 years, that carbon will saturate and you'll get no increase in that soil carbon. So you get no net benefit for the climate. But if you keep cattle on that field for 100 years, they continue to emit methane emissions year on year on year. So the claim that grazing ruminants are a climate change solution is unfounded, it's unsubstantiated. There are many reasons if you're going to decide to eat meat, there are many reasons to choose grazed livestock, but climate change is not one of them. Here's a graph showing some real data on conversion of croplands to grasslands. And if you look at the black line, this was a cropland that was converted to grasslands. These are a number of separate points. After about 100 years, those grassland soil carbon levels, it does increase because the croplands are depleted in carbon. After about 50 to 100 years, those carbon levels level off. That's called saturation. That's what we're showing with saturation. The thing about grasslands is they already contain a lot of carbon. So what you're looking at over here in the red line is the carbon that's already in the grasslands. So if they have any capacity to store carbon at all, many don't, it's likely to be very small. So the maximum benefit you can get in terms of carbon storage before they saturate is actually a very small amount. So they've got limited capacity to store further carbon. So the idea that soil carbon sequestration somehow converts ruminant meat or grazing of ruminant meat into a climate solution rather than a climate problem simply doesn't add up. So let's look at then what we can do. So one solution is to eat less meat and dairy to help tackle climate change. So through dietary change. This was from the last IPC assessment report. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and for the last two assessment reports, I've been leading the agriculture and food chapter of this document, which is produced every 5 to 7 years. This was putting together all the evidence that had gathered since the last report. What we can see over here are the supply side measures. So those improve cropland management, improve grazing land management, improve rice, improve livestock. All of these added together add up to around about 4 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. The numbers don't really matter, but the maximum we could get at high carbon prices between about 4 and 5 gigatons of CO2 per year. What's shown over here in the mustard coloured bars on the right are the contribution of dietary change and waste reduction to greenhouse gas mitigation. And what you can see is that the demand side measures, dietary change and greenhouse gas mitigation, have far more potential than all of the supply side measures added together. So really, for tackling climate change, we both need to improve agriculture, shown over here in this part of the graph, And we also need to change the way that we eat and change the way that we use food so that we have less waste. And that can have a really large contribution. I'll just show you 2 or 3 studies that demonstrate this point really effectively. The first one was a study by Elke Steffest and her team in the Netherlands. And she looked at a number of scenarios for future food consumption. She had a reference scenario, which was based on the projections from the FAO of how much food we need to eat. She then looked at another scenario, which was the same as the first. It had all the same demands for calories and protein and such like. But this one had no ruminant meat. So she tried to meet all of the dietary demand with no ruminant meat. The third scenario, which was no meat at all, so that had no consumption of beef, pork, lamb, chicken, any sort of meat. The fourth scenario she looked at was no animal products at all, so that's including milk and eggs, for example, substituting those with plant-based proteins. So this would be a fully vegan future. And the last one that she looked at was healthy eating recommendations. So this doesn't assume that everybody becomes vegetarian or everybody becomes vegan. It just assumes that everybody eats healthily. So that could mean people in the least developed countries actually eating a bit more meat because they currently eat too little to meet their dietary requirements. But in developed countries, like in Europe and in North America, in the USA, that would greatly reduce the amount of meat that we eat. So this healthy diet came from the Harvard Medical School, but there's also World Health Organization recommendations. And just by applying this, if you looked at what would happen to greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the reference scenario, we have greenhouse gas emissions of about 3.3 gigatons of carbon per year. If we look at the totally vegan world, if nobody ate any animal products on the world, that would slash greenhouse gas emissions to 1/3 of that of the reference scenario. So it reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3. But what's heartening is even if we don't think it's realistic for everybody to become vegan, it's not realistic, I think, to expect everybody to do that. Just by moving to a healthy diet where everybody eats healthily would reduce the emissions by over 1/3. And that is largely due to a reduction in meat and dairy consumption and other forms of meat. So a healthy diet, if we are unable to persuade people to become vegan, and it's a very difficult choice to make, to decide that we're never going to eat meat again. It's a once in a lifetime decision. It's very binary. But not so many people are willing to do that. But people may be willing to consider cutting down their meat consumption a little, just to eat more moderately, to eat meat more moderately. And this could have a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Another study by Alex Kopp's group in Potsdam in Germany shows what will happen with technical mitigation and without technical mitigation. So that's looking at this axis, and looking at the axis up the page, we've got a scenario with increased meat here, and a scenario with decreased meat here. You can see that with technical mitigation potential, these ones, C and D, are lower than A and B. So technical mitigation, that's improving agriculture, will have an effect in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But more importantly, the difference between A and C and B and D is much more pronounced. So the decreased meat consumption is having a far larger impact on reducing emissions than does the technical mitigation. So again, it's suggesting that dietary change is a really important contributor to climate change, reducing meat and dairy consumption. And the last one I'll show you is an example from some work that was done in Cambridge in the UK. And it's looking at what happens if we have current yield trends, what happens if we sustainably intensify agriculture. So this is a scenario where we just improve the way agriculture is done, make it more efficient. And then we superimpose on that these demand side measures. So we have a 50% reduction in food waste, and we move people towards a healthy diet. So this is not an all-vegan or an all-vegetarian world. This is just a world in which everybody eats more healthily. And what we find is that the current yield trends, if we have a look at this current yield trends, we can see what happens to the cropland area. It goes up by 44%. Pasture area goes up. We lose forest cover. We lose pristine tropical forests. Greenhouse gas emissions go up by 64%, fertilizer use and water use. So current yield trends would be a disaster. We can't feed the planet and we can't sustain the planet with current yield trends. What happens if we can close the yield gap by improving agriculture and making it more sustainable? Well, it helps move us in the right direction, but we still have an increase in cropland of 16%, an increase in pasture, we lose forest area, total greenhouse gas emissions still increase by 40%, and we got an increase in fertilizer use and irrigation water use. So this clearly doesn't get us where we need to be. Just by doing technology in agriculture, just by improving things and sustainable intensification, doesn't get us to where we need to be. What if we also use yield gap closure and those demand side options? So that's a healthy diet for everyone on the planet, and we reduce food waste reduction by 50%. And here we can get a reduction in cropland use and pasture use. We get an increase in net forest cover, but we still get a slight decrease overall in the pristine area. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and whilst we still have an increase in fertilizer use and irrigation water, that's much lower than in the other scenarios. So what this study is telling us is that sustainable intensification, improving agriculture, is not enough. We have to also change the way we eat and change the foods that we demand from the food system, as well as reducing waste considerably. And it's not only better for climate change. If we look at the other impacts, the other environmental impacts of plant-based foods compared to ruminant-based foods, if you can see, the ruminant-based foods are at the bottom. So this is ruminant meat at the bottom, going up to the cereals at the top, maize, wheat, and rice, for example. And this is showing the greenhouse gas impact. So the greenhouse gas impact of ruminant meat is many times higher than those of plant-based products. It's very similar to the ones that I've shown too. But not only is it the greenhouse gas emissions that are better, the land use is way better for plant-based foods compared to ruminant meats. The energy use is far better compared to ruminant meats for plant-based products. The acidification potential, this is a measure of air quality. The air quality is greatly improved by a shift to plant-based products. And the eutrophication potential is a measure of water quality. So water quality is also greatly improved by a shift to plant-based products. So ruminant meat has impacts about 100 times worse than those of plant-based foods in all of these categories. So we're not only improving the climate, we're also improving a range of other environmental indicators. The other thing that it does is by reducing animal product consumption, it creates the headspace for us to explore other forms of agriculture. So this is a study where we looked at whether we could feed the world entirely using organic agriculture. And as you might expect, the answer is no, we cannot do it if we sustain the same level of waste and the same level of demand for livestock products. But if we reduce the demand for livestock products and we eliminate animal feeds that could be fed to humans, we find that we could comfortably feed the world using organic agriculture and greatly reduce the impact on nitrogen, for example, deforestation, energy, and pesticide use and land use. So it creates the headspace for us to explore different ways of agriculture. At the moment, we're on an express train of ever increasing intensification. That doesn't have to happen. With a change in demand for the different products that we eat, we could step back from that and we could reimagine an agricultural future that we all want. So what needs to happen? This was a fairly complex study that was published in Nature Climate Change last year. I won't go through it all, but what it shows us is that business as usual greenhouse gas emissions would continue to grow greatly. But the land sector could contribute on our way to getting us towards a 1.5 degree world. 1.5 degrees is the ambition set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. So that's where we need to head towards if we're going to control the worst excesses of climate change and keep the planet within 1.5 degrees of warming. So about 1 gigaton of that mitigation potential comes from agriculture. So that's livestock emissions, rice, croplands, and synthetic fertilizer. So the sorts of things we could do: a shift towards plant-based diets, reducing food waste, reducing emissions from agriculture, so those so-called supply side measures, and then a bunch of other measures like restoring forests and improving forest management and reducing deforestation. If we break that down into a pathway of where we need to go and how soon, the land would have to look like this. The food system has to look like this going forward from 2020, 2030, 2040 to 2050. So this is the implementation roadmap, and it means that we need to shift to plant-based diets, about 50% of adoption by the global population by 2050. So that suggests that 50% of us by 2050 need to be vegan, or the equivalent of that. That could be everybody just consuming 25% less, for example. But a significant number more people being vegan, and the people who continue to eat meat, who decide to continue to eat meat, eating a lot less. Reducing food waste, restoring forests, improving forest, and enhancing soil carbon in agriculture. So these measures, the shift to plant-based diets and reducing food waste and reducing emissions from agriculture, feature really strongly in those pathways to getting us to a position where we could meet the Paris target. So in conclusion, food production and distribution contributes up to 1/3 of global greenhouse gases emitted by human activity, so it's part of the problem. Livestock production is responsible for 58% of all emissions from agriculture, and half of those emissions come from ruminants, such as cattle and sheep. Some people have suggested that grazing animals can sequester carbon in the soil, and even that grazing could help solve climate change, but I've shown that the numbers do not add up. Ruminant meat has 10 to 100 times worse impact on the climate than plant-based foods, as well as 10 to 100 times worse impact on land use, water use, air pollution, and water pollution. So I conclude from that the best thing for the climate and any other aspect of the environment is for all of us to eat less meat and eat less dairy. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions. I'm sure there'll be some. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Pete. Yeah, we do have a lot of questions. I think
Cool.
A lot of our guests are very interested. Wonderful presentation. So I'm just going to start on the list, going off of which ones were upvoted the most. So the first one is by Sed Shane, and he asks, there has been a lot of debate as to whether agriculture is 24% or 51%, depending on the time scale used for global warming potential in comparison of 20 years versus 100 years. Do you have a comment on this?
Sorry, can you say that again? I got an unstable connection there.
So Sed Shane, his inputted question was, there has been a lot of debate as to whether agriculture is 24% or 51%, depending on the timescale used for global warming potential, 20 years versus 100 years. Yeah.
So I haven't heard the 51% figure. The maximum figure that I've seen is in the high 30s as a contribution to overall climate change. But it depends on what you include and what you don't include. So the 24% tends to be the agriculture and forestry sector from the emissions, just from what you're doing on the land. And the food system includes all of the other emissions like the transport and refrigeration and all those sorts of things that contribute the other greenhouse gases that make up. I haven't heard that figure of 51%. I've only heard the maximum I've seen is about in the high 30s%.
Great, thank you. The next one is by Pamela Gordon. Pamela asks, the U.S. meat packing industry has spread COVID-19 among its workers. The president, meaning our president in the United States, considers meatpacking an essential industry, not to be curbed. How can we change our national culture to see meat as non-essential for healthy diets?
Well, I mean, that's up to you. I shouldn't be lecturing to you from Scotland. That's entirely for a matter for you and your voters, but you have a vote in November and I hope you use it.
Okay. Ellie asks, have Alan Savory's claims that holistic grazing can reverse desertification been debunked?
I would say yes, but they persist. So I think scientifically, the vast majority of scientific studies into these systems have largely debunked it. The problem is with holistic grazing is because they say it's adaptive management. So if something's not working, you adapt it, which is a good thing, I suppose, because you can adapt the grazing pattern just to make sure that you're looking after the land as best you can. But it makes it basically unfalsifiable, because if you say we didn't find an effect of this changed grazing pattern, then they would come back and say you didn't find it because you didn't adapt it and you didn't do it properly. So that makes it difficult to study in a fully scientifically controlled experiment. But the fully scientifically controlled experiments show that, I mean, there are lots of benefits to it in terms of grassland biodiversity, all sorts of other benefits. But the carbon sequestration, the climate change one, is not one of them. That's not one of the things that stands up to scrutiny.
Great, thank you. This one's from an anonymous attendee. They said, I've read it suggested recently in a project I was undergoing on silvopasture that if ruminant livestock eat a highly nutritious diet rich in nitrates, that their enteric methane emissions can actually decrease somewhat. Is this something you've come across? And if so, do you consider it to be worth further investigating?
Yes, yeah, it is true that the increasing in food quality, so that would be the case if you improve the nitrogen status of the grass, reduces the amount of methane that's emitted. There are other things like dietary additives. Extracts of garlic, for example, have been shown to have some effect on reducing methane emissions. The problem is if they reduce emissions by 20 or 30%, which is the maximum efficacy that they have, and that only lasts for a period of weeks, but even if it lasted for a long time, you saw from those figures, you've got 10 to 100 times greater greenhouse gas emissions from ruminant livestock. So really you're just fiddling around in the margins when you're trying to reduce enteric fermentation. The only safe way to reduce enteric fermentation is to reduce the number of cattle.
Thank you, Pete. Let's see, this next one is from Kamal. Pretty much all the calculations of the impacts of animal foods used per kilogram of animal product consumed. This makes it look like consuming poultry and eggs is better. However, doesn't the sheer number of those animals, chickens, turkey, for instance, bred for human consumption, puts our aggregate climate change contribution on par with ruminants?
Yeah, it doesn't quite, but you're right. There are really large numbers of animals involved. You know, pig and poultry especially. So in almost all developing countries, the consumption of beef is going down, but the consumption of chicken is going way up. So chicken and chicken products are rapidly increasing. So there is a lower greenhouse gas footprint because they don't emit methane. They're not ruminants. So we don't get those methane emissions, which are the big contributor to climate change. But it does raise the question, you know, what if we switch from ruminant meat to pig and poultry? It would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But on the other hand, ruminants were bred to eat grass, which we can't eat. You know, as humans, we can't get human edible protein out of that grass. So maybe ruminants are the best way to do it. The food that's fed to pigs and poultry is exactly the same food that we could eat. So it would be better to further process that food to grow better food, better quality food, and consume it directly than to go through that intermediate sort of shift towards pig and poultry.
Thank you so much. Do you have time for 2 more questions?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Great. This is an interesting one. They want to know your thoughts on plant-based meats, such as Impossible Foods. You know, currently this industry is really blowing up. There's a huge demand for it. It's becoming more affordable, and there's a wider variety of options. Do you have an opinion on these?
Yeah, I became a vegetarian in 1989, and it was really, really difficult to get any vegetarian products. I was brought up eating meat, and I love the taste of meat, and I love the flavor of meat. So I wanted to continue eating products that tasted and smelled and everything that like meat. It was really difficult in 1989 to get vegetarian products. Now you can find vegan products that are a million times better than those, and it's really easy to buy in most supermarkets. So those foods, we have to think about the health implications of those. You know, plant-based foods aren't necessarily more healthy if they've got loads of salt and lots of fat in them. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't always go hand in hand. But a lot of those products are really, really good. And Impossible Burgers and Beyond Meat and those things, I think they're fantastic. And I do enjoy them.
Great. Okay, and then the very last one, when advocating for this in our community, what are the primary counterpoints to this proposal and how do you address those? Of course, every community, can you still hear me?
Say that again.
Okay, when advocating for this in our community, what are the primary counterpoints to this proposal and how do you address those?
I suppose the primary counterpoints are that we have to make sure that that people can afford to eat differently. It's relatively cheap to eat processed meat, and it can often cost a little more to eat vegan and vegetarian alternatives. So I think it's important to make sure that if with the dietary change that there's a just transition, that we don't penalise the poorest and those with least in society, and that they end up getting even worse diets. They already have the worst diets among us. And that could be exacerbated if we pushed all the production towards plant-based foods that were more expensive. They don't have to be more expensive. They are at the moment because they're feeding a niche market. But because they're so much more efficient to produce, they should actually be cheaper. Probably the Impossible Burger, they don't want to know, they don't want to hear that, but they're probably actually cheaper to produce than livestock without subsidies.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Pete, for your time. Again, wonderful presentation. I personally learned a lot from it. And thank you for everyone that attended our event. Just a reminder, we will be sending out the recording of this event to all of you via email. I got a lot of questions about that. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thank you again and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.